A city moves fast when it doesn't care. Hundreds of expensive shoes stepped around the frail woman, tapping her cane against the wet curb. To the rush-hour crowd, she was a nuisance. To the criminal underworld, she was untouchable, the mother of the city's most ruthless syndicate boss. But Rebecca just saw someone who needed a hand. When the exhausted waitress stepped out of the diner to help her cross the street, she wasn't just guiding an old woman. She was walking dead into the crosshairs of a cartel. The neon sign in the window of the brass kettle hummed with a persistent mosquito-like buzz. Rebecca had stopped hearing it 3 years ago. What she did hear with agonizing clarity was the dull ache in her lower back and the squelch of her cheap, non-slip shoes against the greasy linoleum. 16 hours! That was how long she had been on her feet. Someone had called out sick, the manager had threatened her with termination if she didn't cover the shift, and Rebecca's rent was due in 3 days. Her reality was measured in crumpled dollar bills left on sticky tables and the smell of stale fryer oil that she could never quite wash out of her hair. She stood behind the counter, wiping a damp rag over the faux wood laminate, for the 5th time staring out the streaky front window. Outside, the sky had bruised into a deep, stormy purple. The rain was coming down hard, slicking the pavement in a coat of greasy neon. The intersection of 5th and Alder was a chaotic mess of blaring horns, impatient taxis, and pedestrians hunched under umbrellas, rushing to get out of the downpour. That was when she saw her. An elderly woman stood at the edge of the curb. She was small, fragile-looking, bundled in an impeccably tailored charcoal wool coat that looked entirely out of place in this part of town. But it wasn't her clothes that caught Rebecca's attention. It was the white cane. The woman was tapping it frantically against the edge of the sidewalk. The walk signal had turned red, but the rain was drowning out the automated crosswalk chirp. She took a half-step forward into the street, just as a delivery cyclist blew past his handlebars, catching the sleeve of her coat. The woman stumbled backward, dropping her cane. It clattered into the gutter. Rebecca watched as the pedestrian light turned green again. A tide of people surged forward. They stepped around the old woman. A man in a sharp suit elbowed past her, muttering something under his breath. A teenager glued to his phone stepped directly on the fallen cane, snapping the plastic tip, and didn't even look back. The woman was reaching down her hands, grasping blindly at the wet concrete panic, settling into the rigid lines of her face. Hey, Rebecca's manager, a permanently sweating man named Gary, snapped his fingers in front of her face. Table 4 needs a refill, and you haven't rolled the silverware. Rebecca didn't look at him. She looked at the woman in the rain. Rebecca, I swear to God, if you zone out on me again. Rebecca dropped the damp rag onto the counter. Fire me if you want, Gary. I need 5 minutes. Before he could yell, she pushed through the heavy glass door and stepped out into the biting cold. The rain immediately soaked through her thin cotton uniform shirt, plastering it to her skin. She didn't run. Running in these shoes on wet pavement was a death sentence, but she moved with a blunt, determined force, shoving past a group of businessmen blocking the sidewalk. Watch it, sweetheart, one of them snapped. Rebecca ignored him. She reached the curb just as the woman was about to step down into the gutter to feel for her cane. Don't, Rebecca said, her voice raspy from a day of taking orders. She bent down, her knees popping, and snatched the cane from a puddle. The tip was broken, but it was intact. The woman recoiled, pulling her coat tight. Her eyes were milky, staring somewhere just over Rebecca's left shoulder. I didn't ask for help. Her voice was cultured, sharp as shattered glass, and trembling slightly. Nobody asked if you did, Rebecca replied smoothly. She didn't do pity. Pity was cheap. She wiped the muddy handle of the cane on her apron and pressed it into the woman's gloved hand. You dropped your stick. The light's changing in 10 seconds and these cabs don't stop for anybody. The woman gripped the cane tightly, her jaw set stubbornly. I can manage. I am simply disoriented. The rain alters the acoustics of the street. Sure, Rebecca said. A cab tore past, spraying a sheet of dirty water toward them. Rebecca stepped in front of the woman, taking the brunt of the splash against her jeans. She sighed, the cold water seeping through to her calves. Look, lady, you can stand out here and pretend you've got it figured out until a bus flattens you, or you can come inside the diner where it's dry and figure it out there. Your call. But I'm freezing, and I have to go back to work. The woman paused. The defensive posture cracked just a fraction. She reached out her gloved fingers, brushing the damp cotton of Rebecca's sleeve. You're shivering. I'm soaked, Rebecca corrected. Come on. She didn't offer her arm gently. She just held it out steady and firm. After an agonizingly long second, the old woman looped her arm through Rebecca's. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her knuckles digging into Rebecca's bicep. I am Clara, the woman announced, as they stepped out of the rain and into the diner. I'm Rebecca, she said, leading Clara to a corner booth far from the drafty door. Slide in. Don't slip on the vinyl. Rebecca grabbed a handful of paper napkins from the dispenser and tossed them on the table. Dry your face. I'll get you a tea. Don't worry, it's on me. I have money, Clara said stiffly, her pride flaring up again. Rebecca looked at the Chanel buttons on Clara's coat. I know you do, but our tea tastes like dirty dishwater, and I'd feel bad making you pay for it. She turned and walked back to the counter, ignoring Gary's murderous glare. She didn't know who Clara was. She just knew what it felt like to be completely invisible in a city full of people, and she refused to let the old woman feel it too. To Roman Costa, the city was not a place of residence. It was a ledger. Every street corner, every shipping container at the docks, every high-rise under construction, it was all math. Blood money and leverage. Right now, the math was violently out of balance. Roman sat in the back of a heavily armored black SUV. The leather smelled faintly of gun oil and expensive cologne. Outside, the rain lashed against the bulletproof glass, warping the city lights into streaks of bleeding color. The cabin was dead silent. The two men in the front seats, hardened enforcers who broke bones for a living, were rigid with terror. Neither dared to look in the rearview mirror. Say it again, Roman said. His voice was quiet. It didn't boom. It didn't need to. It had the low, terrifying rumble of a fault line right before the earth split. The man in the passenger seat, a lieutenant named Tommy, swallowed hard. She slipped the detail, Mr. Costa. We had 3 men on the perimeter of the brownstone. She told the inside nurse she was going to lay down. By the time the nurse checked the room 20 minutes later, the back service door was unlocked. She was gone. Roman stared at the back of Tommy's neck. He was 34, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than the SUV he was riding in. He had inherited his father's empire 5 years ago and ruthlessly pruned the dead branches. He did not tolerate mistakes. She is blind, Tommy. Roman stated, articulating each word with agonizing precision. She is 71 years old, and she requires medication to keep her heart beating at a regular rhythm. She walked out of a fortified house without 3 armed guards noticing. We're sweeping the grid, Tommy said quickly, his voice cracking. We have 20 cars out. She can't have gotten far. She likes to walk toward the park when she gets confused. Roman closed his eyes. The headache that had been building behind his temples finally blossomed into a sharp, blinding pain. His mother's mind had been slipping over the last year. Dementia, the doctors whispered, though never to her face. She was too proud, too sharp-tongued. She hated the guards. She hated being managed. And today, of all days, the anniversary of his father's assassination, the ghosts in her head must have been loud enough to make her wander. Roman pulled out his phone. If we don't find her in the next 10 minutes, I am going to have you both thrown off the Alder Bridge. Am I understood?" "Yes, boss." The radio on the dashboard crackled to life. "Unit 4. We got a visual. She's at 5th and Alder, inside a diner called the Brass Kettle." Roman felt the air rush back into his lungs, but his expression remained carved from stone. "Drive," he ordered. The SUV swerved through traffic illegally, cutting across 2 lanes and jumping the curb right in front of the grimy diner. The tires threw up a wave of dirty water. Before the vehicle had even completely stopped, Roman shoved his door open and stepped into the rain. He ignored the downpour. His eyes locked onto the large, smeared window of the diner. He expected to see her panicked. He expected her to be cornered, terrified by the noise and the unfamiliar smells, perhaps being harassed by the local vagrants. His hand instinctively brushed the cold steel of the Sig Sauer, holstered beneath his jacket. Instead, he stopped dead on the sidewalk. Clara was sitting in a red vinyl booth. Her coat was unbuttoned. She looked relaxed. Across from her sat a young woman in a cheap, faded diner uniform. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, damp with rain, and there were dark purple bags of exhaustion under her eyes. Roman watched, motionless. The waitress was talking. She wasn't leaning in with exaggerated patronizing care the way Clara's nurses did. She was leaning back against the booth, arms crossed, talking to his mother like she was a normal, functioning human being. Clara said something, her chin lifting in that haughty, aristocratic way Roman knew so well. The waitress let out a short, tired laugh. She reached across the table, grabbed a paper napkin, and unceremoniously wiped a smudge of dirt off the cuff of Clara's Chanel coat. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't swat the girl's hand away. She simply reached out her fingers blindly, finding the thick ceramic mug on the table, and took a sip of tea. Roman stood in the rain, the cold water soaking into his wool suit. 2 more black SUVs pulled up behind his, idling ominously in the street. 4 large men stepped out, moving to flank him. "Boss?" Tommy asked, stepping up behind him, drenched and breathless. "Do we secure the building?" Roman raised a hand, stopping him. He continued to watch the girl through the glass. He noted the way she didn't hover. He noted the way she had placed Clara's cane perfectly parallel to the table, within easy reach of her hand. She was treating the former matriarch of the Costa family, a woman who had once ordered a hit on a rival boss while sipping an espresso like an equal. "No," Roman murmured, his dark eyes fixed on the waitress's tired, expressive face. "Stay out here. I'll get her." The bell above the door jingled, a tinny, cheerful sound that violently contradicted the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Rebecca didn't look up right away. She was busy sliding a plate of burnt toast toward a trucker at the counter. But she felt the temperature in the diner drop. It was subtle at first. The low murmur of conversation sputtered and died. The clinking of silverware stopped. She turned around. A man was standing just inside the entrance. He was tall, imposingly so, and built like a heavyweight boxer poured into a bespoke suit. Water dripped from his dark, severely cut hair onto the shoulders of his jacket. He didn't look like a customer. He looked like the kind of man who owned the bank that held the mortgage on the building. His eyes cold and dark as a starless night swept the room once. Rebecca watched as the trucker at the counter suddenly stood up, left a $20 bill next to his half-eaten food, and bolted for the back exit. Gary, the manager, had miraculously disappeared into the kitchen, entirely abandoning the front of house. The man didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at Rebecca. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps straight toward the corner booth. Rebecca's protective instincts flared. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the counter, intercepting him halfway down the aisle. "Hey," she said, her voice sharp. "Booth's taken, buddy. You need a table, you wait to be seated." Roman stopped. He looked down at her. Up close, the sheer physical presence of him was suffocating. He smelled of rain-expensive leather and something metallic and sharp beneath it. He looked at her with a blank, assessing stare that made Rebecca's exhausted stomach do a slow, uncomfortable flip. He didn't say a word to her. He simply sidestepped her and continued toward the booth. Roman Clara's voice rang out from the vinyl seat. Her head turned sharply toward the sound of his footsteps. "Is that you? You smell like a wet dog." Roman reached the table. The terrifying mask melted just a fraction, the hard lines around his mouth softening as he looked at the old woman. "It's me, Ma. You took 10 years off my life today." Rebecca, who had followed him, stopped dead in her tracks. "Ma." She looked from the terrifying giant in the tailored suit to the fragile blind woman sipping cheap tea. The resemblance was there in the sharp line of the jaw, the proud, stubborn set of the shoulders. "I was merely taking a walk," Clara said, dismissively, setting her mug down. "Your men hover. I despise hovering. They hover because you walked blindly into one of the busiest intersections in the city," Roman said. His voice was low, laced with a mix of fury and profound relief. He reached out his large, calloused hand, gently cupping the side of her face. "You could have been killed." "Well, I wasn't," Clara said. She reached out, gesturing vaguely toward the aisle. "Rebecca assisted me." Roman finally turned to look at the waitress. Rebecca stood her ground. She was terrified. Her survival instincts were screaming at her that this man was dangerous, but she was also running on 3 hours of sleep, and her feet hurt too much to back down. "She was standing in the middle of traffic," Rebecca said, crossing her arms over her damp shirt. "While your guys were supposedly watching her. If you're going to hire babysitters, make sure they actually do their job. Or buy her a brighter coat so people don't run her over in the rain." Silence fell over the diner. It was absolute. Even the hum of the fryers seemed to vanish. Roman stared at her. Nobody spoke to him like that. Men had begged for their lives in front of him. Politicians had sweated through their shirts trying to appease him. And here was a waitress with mustard stains on her apron, scolding him like a negligent child. He stepped closer to her. He towered over her, casting a long, dark shadow. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I'm talking to a guy who lost his blind mother in a thunderstorm." Rebecca shot back, her chin lifting. "Do better." For a second, she thought he might actually hit her. The air between them crackled with a sudden violent tension. But then Roman's gaze shifted. He looked at the broken cane resting on the table. He looked at Clara's dry face, and then back down at Rebecca's soaked, shivering form. She had taken the rein so his mother wouldn't have to. Roman reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a silver money clip that held a stack of bills thicker than Rebecca's monthly rent. He peeled off $500 bills and dropped them onto the table next to the tea. "For your trouble," Roman said flatly. He turned to Clara. "Come on, Ma. The car is waiting." He gently helped his mother to her feet, taking the cane and guiding her arm. They started toward the door. Rebecca stared at the green paper on the table. A surge of hot, unadulterated anger flared in her chest. She snatched the bills and marched after them, catching the heavy glass door, just as Roman pushed it open. "Hey!" she called out into the rain. Roman turned, shielding Clara with an umbrella one of his men had hurriedly produced. Rebecca shoved the wad of cash hard into Roman's chest. He reflexively caught it. "I didn't do it for a payout." She snapped the rein, instantly soaking her face again. "I did it because she's a human being. Keep your money." She stepped back inside and let the door swing shut, locking the deadbolt for good measure. Through the glass, Roman stood motionless on the wet pavement. He looked at the crumpled bills in his fist. Then he looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Rebecca through the smear of the rain-streaked window. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked entirely deeply captivated. And as the black SUV pulled away from the curb, Rebecca had a sinking, terrible feeling that she hadn't seen the last of him. The deadbolt clicked into place with a heavy metallic thud. Rebecca rested her forehead against the cool glass of the diner door. Her breathing was uneven. Outside, the rain washed away the tire tracks of the black SUV, leaving the street empty and shining under the street lamps. She turned around. Gary was standing by the grease traps, his face the color of old oatmeal. A damp rag dangled limply from his fist. "You're out of your mind," Gary whispered. His voice lacked its usual abrasive edge. It was hollowed out by pure, unadulterated panic. "You are completely clinically insane." Rebecca bent down and picked up a stray napkin from the floor. He was being a jerk. "He is Roman Costa," Gary shrieked, finally finding his volume. He threw the rag onto the counter, pacing in tight, frantic circles. "He owns the docks. He owns half the unions. The guy who owned the vending machine contract for this block looked at him wrong last year, and they found his car crushed into a cube at the scrapyard. With him inside it." Rebecca stopped. A cold prickle of adrenaline worked its way down her spine, settling uncomfortably in her lower back. She looked at the empty corner booth where the blind woman had sat. Roman Costa. The name meant something, even to her, someone who actively avoided the local news. It meant old money, old blood, and a total terrifying immunity to the law. "Well," Rebecca said, keeping her voice level. He was still a jerk. She didn't sleep that night. Her apartment was a fourth-floor walk-up with a radiator that hissed like an angry snake and a window that didn't quite close. She lay in the dark, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across her cracked ceiling. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Roman Costa standing in the diner. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his stare. It wasn't the look of a man who was used to being told no. It was the look of a man mapping out a demolition. When her alarm went off at 5 in the morning, she felt like she had been beaten with a bag of sand. She dragged herself out of bed, pulled on a clean, stiff uniform shirt, and took the bus back to the diner. She expected the place to be burned to the ground. It wasn't. The brass kettle stood exactly as it always did, looking slightly sadder in the pale morning light. But the atmosphere inside had fundamentally shifted. Rebecca felt it the second she tied her apron. The morning rush, usually a cacophony of clanking mugs and shouting line cooks, was muted. Customers were keeping their heads down. Gary was hiding in his office, completely invisible. She grabbed her notepad and walked out to the floor. 2 men were sitting in booth 4. They weren't truckers. They weren't hungover college students. They were wearing identical dark suits that didn't wrinkle when they sat. Neither of them had touched the laminated menus. They were just sitting there, their hands resting flat on the table, watching the door. Rebecca recognized the guy on the left. It was the one who had been holding the umbrella for Clara yesterday. Her stomach tightened. She walked over to them, pulling a pen from her apron. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice deliberately flat. The man who had held the umbrella looked up at her. He didn't smile. "Black, for both of us." "Thank you." She poured the coffee. They didn't drink it. They sat there for her entire 8-hour shift. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't look at their phones. They just watched the room, and every time Rebecca moved past them, she felt their eyes track her. It was psychological warfare. They were making a point. "We know where you are. We own this space now." By 2 in the afternoon, her nerves were completely frayed. She dropped a plate of fries, shattering the ceramic loudly against the floor. The diner went dead silent. The 2 men in the booth simply watched her sweep it up. At exactly 3 o'clock, the bell above the door jingled. Rebecca didn't look up from the cash register. She didn't need to. The air pressure in the room dropped again, That same heavy, ozone-scented tension rolling in off the street. Roman Costa walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit today, which somehow made him more intimidating. He wore a dark, heavy wool sweater and dark jeans. Without the tailored armor, the sheer physical bulk of him was undeniable. He didn't look at the two men in the booth. He walked straight to the counter and sat on a vinyl stool directly across from the register. Rebecca closed the till with a sharp crack. She leaned her hands on the counter, refusing to back away. "Menu?" she asked. "I don't eat diner food," Roman said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone. Up close, his eyes weren't just dark. They were an intricate, heavily guarded maze. "Then you're taking up paying space." Roman reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out the money clip this time. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy cardstock and slid it across the laminate counter. Rebecca looked down. It was a check. It was already made out to her. The number written on it made the breath catch in her throat. "What is this?" she asked, her voice suddenly tight. "Compensation," Roman said simply. "For yesterday. And a retainer." Rebecca stared at the zeros. $10,000. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was a new apartment. It was 6 months of sleep. It was freedom. She pushed the check back across the counter. Her hand was shaking, but she forced her grip to remain steady. "I told you yesterday. I don't want your money." Roman watched her finger slide the paper back to him. He didn't look angry. He looked fascinated. "Sit down, Rebecca," he said. "I'm working. Gary left out the back door 20 minutes ago. The cook is hiding in the pantry. Your shift is over. Sit down." Rebecca glanced toward the kitchen. It was empty. The greasy swinging doors were perfectly still. She swallowed the dry lump of fear in her throat, walked around the counter, and sat on the stool next to him. She kept a foot on the floor, ready to bolt. Roman turned his body slightly to face her. "My mother has vascular dementia," he said, skipping any pretense of small talk. "It is progressing rapidly. She fired her 3rd nurse this week. She throws things at them. She refuses to eat when they cook for her. She refuses to sleep when they are in the house." Rebecca frowned, the raw anger in her chest faltering for a second. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because she slept for 9 hours last night," Roman said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "She woke up this morning, ate a full breakfast, and asked where the girl with the bad attitude went." Rebecca let out a short, incredulous laugh. "She thinks I have a bad attitude. She thinks you treat her like a person," Roman corrected. The humor didn't reach his eyes, but a fraction of the coldness receded. "Everyone in my world treats her like glass because they are terrified of me. The medical staff treats her like a liability. You dragged her out of the rain and told her to figure it out. She was going to get hit by a cab. She needs a companion, someone to sit with her during the day. Make sure she doesn't wander off. Talk to her. Argue with her. I don't care what you do, as long as you keep her in the house." Roman tapped the check on the counter. $5,000 a week. Cash. You get a driver. You get meals. You are untouchable while you are in my employ. Rebecca stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit her like a physical blow. The head of the Costa family was sitting in a run-down diner, offering her a fortune to babysit his mother. She looked at the check. The temptation was a physical ache in her chest. $5,000 a week. "No," she said. Roman's hand stilled. The silence stretched, turning brittle and dangerous. "No," he repeated softly. "I know who you are now," Rebecca said. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to look him in the eye. "I know what you do. I don't want your money because I know where it comes from. I'm not getting involved in your world." Roman tilted his head. He looked at her with a brutal, piercing clarity. "My world," he echoed. "Rebecca, you owe $4,000 to a loan shark named Tommy the Rat Sullivan. Your ex-boyfriend racked it up playing dice, bailed to Florida, and left you holding the bag. You are 2 months behind on your rent. Your landlord is changing the locks on Monday. You have $82 in your checking account." Rebecca's blood ran cold. The diner seemed to shrink. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "You looked into me. I investigate anyone who comes within 10 feet of my mother," Roman said, his voice entirely devoid of apology. "You think you're isolated from my world? You work for Gary. Gary runs a backdoor poker game for the O'Keefe Syndicate every Thursday night. You are already in the mud, Rebecca. The only difference is you're starving in it. I am offering to pull you out by making me a mobster's pet." She spat humiliation, burning hot in her cheeks. He had stripped her bare in 3 sentences. He knew exactly how pathetic her life was. Roman stood up. He didn't loom over her, but the shadow he cast was inescapable. He picked up the check, folded it in half, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. He moved so fast she didn't have time to flinch. His knuckles brushed against her ribs, a brief, shocking point of heat. "I am offering you a job," Roman said quietly. "Nothing more. If Sullivan comes collecting before Monday, call the number on the back of that check. Do not try to handle him yourself." He turned and walked toward the door. The 2 men in the booth stood up in perfect synchronization, following him out into the grey afternoon. Rebecca stood frozen by the counter, the piece of paper in her pocket feeling heavier than a block of lead. The rain had returned by the time Rebecca finished locking up the diner. It was a cold, miserable drizzle that seeped into her bones. The streetlights flickered, fighting a losing battle against the encroaching darkness. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself and headed for the alley behind the building to toss the day's garbage. The bags were heavy, reeking of sour milk and rotting coffee grounds. She hoisted the first one into the dumpster, the lid banging loudly against the brick wall. "Working late, Harpy?" Rebecca froze. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The voice was like rusty metal grating against stone. She slowly turned. 3 men were standing at the mouth of the alley, blocking her only exit. The one in the middle was Sullivan. He wasn't the kind of loan shark who wore suits or sat in nice cars. He was a street-level enforcer, built like a fire hydrant, with a face mapped by old knife scars. He chewed on a toothpick, his eyes scanning her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "I get paid on Friday, Sullivan," Rebecca said, keeping her back pressed against the cold metal of the dumpster. She calculated the distance to the side door of the diner. 10 feet. Too far. Sullivan spat the toothpick onto the wet asphalt. "Yeah, see, that's what you said last Friday, and the Friday before that. Ricky owes me $4,000. With interest, we're looking at 6. And since Ricky is currently enjoying the sunshine in Miami, I gotta collect from his co-signer. I didn't sign anything. You lived with him. Good enough for me." Sullivan took a step forward. The 2 men beside him, grimy, heavy-set thugs, mirrored his movement. "I'm tired of waiting, sweetheart. Gary says you pull maybe $300 a week in tips. Math don't work out, so we're gonna explore alternative payment methods." He lunged. Rebecca scrambled backward, her foot slipping on a patch of greasy cardboard. She hit the brick wall hard, the breath knocking out of her lungs. Sullivan grabbed her by the front of her jacket, his grip twisting the fabric tight against her throat. He smelled of stale beer and cheap tobacco. "Scream and I'll break your jaw," he hissed, pressing his forearm against her collarbone, pinning her to the wall. Panic blind and suffocating clawed at her throat. She kicked out her cheap sneaker connecting with his shin. Sullivan grunted, his eyes flashing with sudden vicious anger. He raised a massive fist. Rebecca squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away. The blow never came. There was a wet, sickening thwack. The pressure against Rebecca's throat vanished so suddenly she stumbled forward, gasping for air. She opened her eyes. Sullivan was on his knees. Blood was pouring from his nose, painting his mouth crimson. Standing over him, perfectly calm in the drizzling rain, was the man who had ordered black coffee at the diner a few hours ago. The man with the umbrella. The two thugs who had come with Sullivan were already incapacitated. One was groaning on the ground, clutching a broken knee. The other was pinned face-first against the brick wall by the second man in the suit, a suppressed pistol pressed casually against the base of his skull. The alley was dead silent, except for the rain and Sullivan's wet, gurgling breaths. The man with the umbrella, Tommy, she remembered Roman calling him yesterday, wiped his bruised knuckles on a crisp white handkerchief. He looked down at Sullivan with profound boredom. "Mr. Costa does not like it when people touch his employees," Tommy said mildly. Sullivan looked up, his eyes widening in sudden, horrific comprehension. He looked from Tommy to the suited man with the gun, and finally to Rebecca. The realization of exactly whose territory he had just stepped into washed the remaining color from his face. I didn't know," Sullivan stammered, blood bubbling on his lips. "I swear to God, I didn't know she was with Costa." "You do now," Tommy said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "The debt is cancelled. If you or anyone you know ever looks in this woman's direction again, I will personally feed you your own teeth. Nod if you understand." Sullivan nodded frantically, clutching his shattered nose. "Good. Walk away." Sullivan scrambled to his feet, slipping on the wet pavement, and ran out of the alley. His two men limped and stumbled after him, fleeing into the shadows. Rebecca stood, frozen. Her chest heaved. Her knees were trembling violently. She looked at Tommy, the adrenaline slowly giving way to a bone-deep, terrifying shock. Tommy folded his handkerchief and put it away. He turned to her. His demeanor shifted instantly from lethal enforcer to polite driver. "Are you hurt, Miss Davis?" he asked. "No," she whispered, her voice barely working. "No. How did you get here?" "We never left," Tommy said. He gestured toward the street. "Mr. Costa is waiting for you in the car." Rebecca didn't argue. The fight had been completely drained out of her. The illusion that she had any control over her own life had shattered the moment Sullivan grabbed her, and Roman Costa had swept up the pieces before they even hit the ground. She walked out of the alley. The black armored SUV was idling at the curb. The rear passenger door was open. Rebecca stepped up to the edge of the door and looked inside. The cabin was warm, smelling of rich leather and ambient heat. Roman was sitting in the back, a tablet resting on his knees. The faint blue light illuminated the hard geometric planes of his face. He didn't look at her like a savior. He looked at her like a man who had made a calculation and found the result exactly as he predicted. He set the tablet aside and looked at her shivering, rain-soaked form. "Did he hurt you?" Roman asked. The question was quiet, but the violent undertone in his voice made the hair on her arm stand up. "No," Rebecca said. "Get in." She hesitated for a fraction of a second. She reached into her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed against the folded check. The retainer, the cage. She climbed into the SUV. The heavy door pulled shut behind her, with a solid, airtight thunk, cutting off the sound of the rain and the city entirely. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly into the traffic. Rebecca sat stiffly on the edge of the leather seat. She didn't look at Roman. She stared straight ahead at the privacy partition separating them from Tommy. "You set that up," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "You knew he was coming. I knew his collection schedule, Roman corrected smoothly. I simply chose not to intervene until you understood exactly what your situation was. Rebecca turned her head to look at him. You let him attack me to prove a point. I let him lay a hand on your jacket, Roman said, his eyes narrowing slightly. If I had wanted you hurt, you would be bleeding in that alley. I wanted you to see the reality of your life, Rebecca. You pride yourself on surviving, but you were drowning. I just threw you a rope. And if I didn't want the rope, you got in the car. It was a statement of absolute fact. There was no argument to be made. Roman reached out and picked up a heavy wool blanket folded on the seat next to him. He shook it out and draped it over Rebecca's shoulders. The gesture was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the ruthless manipulation he had just confessed to. My mother expects you at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Roman said, returning his attention to his tablet. Tommy will pick you up at your apartment. He will also assist you in packing. You are moving into the east wing of the estate. Rebecca clutched the blanket tight around her chest. The warmth was slowly seeping into her cold skin, but the chill in her blood remained. She had traded one set of monsters for another. But as she looked at Roman's severe, uncompromising profile in the dim light of the cabin, she realized with a sinking heart that this monster didn't just want her obedience. He wanted her to belong to him. The Costa estate did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress that had been forced to wear the disguise of a 19th-century manor. Rebecca sat in the back of the SUV as the heavy wrought-iron gates swung open silently. The driveway was a winding ribbon of crushed white gravel that crunched methodically beneath the thick tires. Thick, ancient oak trees lined the path, their branches heavy with rain blocking out the morning sun. Everywhere she looked, there were men. They were dressed in groundskeeper uniforms or plain dark jackets, but they all stood with the same rigid, hyper-vigilant posture Tommy had. Tommy parked the SUV near a side entrance. He had shown up at Rebecca's apartment at 6 in the morning, packed her meager belongings into 2 duffel bags, while she sat in stunned silence, and drove her out of the city limits. "The East Wing," Tommy said, opening her door. "Miss Clara's quarters are on the ground floor. Your room is directly above hers. The stairs are internal." Rebecca stepped out. The air here smelled different. It didn't smell like exhaust and fryer grease. It smelled like wet earth pine and expensive stone. She followed Tommy inside. The interior of the house was suffocatingly quiet. The floors were dark, polished mahogany that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. There were no photographs on the walls, only massive, gloomy oil paintings and antique mirrors that reflected the empty hallways back at themselves. "She is in the sunroom," Tommy said, stopping at a set of heavy double doors. He didn't open them. He simply nodded at Rebecca and walked away, disappearing down the corridor. Rebecca stood alone for a moment. She adjusted the collar of her plain cotton sweater. She had left her diner uniform in the trash can of her old apartment. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the heavy doors open. The sunroom was the only bright place she had seen so far. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a sprawling, perfectly manicured lawn. Clara sat in a high-backed wicker chair, a thick cashmere blanket draped over her knees. The blind woman's head turned sharply at the squeak of the door hinges. "They changed the oil on those hinges 3 days ago." Clara snapped her voice, carrying that same aristocratic bite. "They are incompetent. Who is that?" "It's Rebecca." Clara's rigid posture relaxed a fraction. She reached out her fingers, tapping the small table next to her. "You took the job. I told Roman you wouldn't." "He made an incredibly aggressive counteroffer," Rebecca said dryly. She walked over and sat on the edge of the sofa opposite the old woman. She didn't bother trying to sound cheerful. "So, what do we do now? He's paying me $5 grand a week." Do you want me to read to you? Play cards. Plot the overthrow of a rival family. A short, genuine bark of laughter escaped Clara's lips. It was a rusty sound, like she hadn't used it in years. The nurses usually try to feed me oatmeal and speak to me as if I am a particularly slow golden retriever. I hate oatmeal, Rebecca said, and I don't do baby talk. Good. Clara leaned back, closing her milky eyes. My son believes I need a babysitter. He believes my mind is unraveling. Is it? Rebecca asked bluntly. Clara didn't bristle at the question. The frankness seemed to soothe her. Sometimes, she admitted, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Sometimes the walls move. Sometimes I hear my husband walking down the hall, and I forget that they buried him in a closed casket 10 years ago. It is humiliating. Rebecca looked at the proud, broken woman. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't say it's going to be okay, because it wasn't. Dementia was a one-way street. When my mum got sick, Rebecca said quietly, staring out at the rain-soaked lawn, she used to forget my name. She'd call me by her sister's name. I used to correct her, and it would just make her cry. Eventually, I just started answering to Sarah. Clara remained silent for a long time. Then she reached out her hand. It hung in the empty air between them. Rebecca leaned forward and took it. Clara's grip was tight, desperate. If I see ghosts, Rebecca, Clara said, her voice completely stripped of its usual armor, do not lie to me. Tell me they are ghosts. I will. A floorboard creaked in the hallway just outside the open doors. Rebecca pulled her hand back and turned her head. Roman was standing in the doorway. He wore a dark suit. His tie loosened, a thick file folder clutched in his hand. He had been listening. The cold, calculating mask he usually wore was fractured, revealing a raw, bleeding wound underneath. He looked at his mother, and then his dark, unreadable eyes shifted to Rebecca. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The heavy magnetic pull between them, born of violence in an alley and quiet empathy in a sunroom, hummed in the quiet air. He gave Rebecca a single slow nod of acknowledgement, turned, and vanished into the shadows of the house. 3 weeks blurred into a strange, isolated routine. Rebecca's life was reduced to the east wing of the Costa estate. She ate food prepared by a private chef, slept on a mattress that cost more than her college tuition, and spent her days arguing with a former Mafia matriarch. Clara was a difficult woman. She was stubborn, quick to anger, and deeply resentful of her failing body. But Rebecca matched her step for step. When Clara threw a teacup at the wall in a fit of frustration, Rebecca didn't flinch or coddle her. She simply handed Clara a broom and told her to sweep it up. It worked. The demand for accountability anchored Clara to reality better than any medication. Roman remained a ghost in his own house. Rebecca saw him in passing a dark, towering silhouette in the study, a low voice echoing from the dining room late at night. He ran an empire of blood and concrete, and the house was the nerve center. Men in heavy coats came and went at all hours, but the violence of his world stopped exactly at the heavy oak doors of the east wing. He kept it away from them. Until late November, the first snow of the year had started falling, just after dusk, blanketing the grounds in a suffocating white silence. Rebecca was in her room reading a paperback when she heard the scream. It wasn't a yell of anger. It was a high, thin sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Rebecca dropped her book and sprinted down the internal staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. She burst into Clara's bedroom. The room was in chaos. A heavy bedside lamp lay shattered on the rug. Clara was backed into the corner of the room, clutching her cane like a weapon. She was hyperventilating, her milky eyes wide, and unseeing, staring blindly at the dark window. "Get him out!" Clara shrieked, swinging the cane wildly at the empty air. "Antonio, Antonio, they're in the house! The gun, get the gun!" She was trapped in a memory, a violent one. Before Rebecca could move, the bedroom door flew open. Roman walked in. He had shed his jacket, and the white dress shirt clung to his broad shoulders. He looked exhausted, but the scream had triggered a lethal readiness in him. A heavy matte black pistol was gripped in his right hand. He scanned the room in a fraction of a second, found no threat, and instantly lowered the weapon. He saw his mother cowering in the corner. "Ma," Roman said, stepping forward. His voice cracked. He reached out to her. "Ma, it's me. It's Roman. There's nobody here." "Don't touch me!" Clara screamed, swinging the heavy wooden cane. The brass handle caught Roman squarely across the cheekbone. The crack echoed in the room. Roman's head snapped to the side. A thin line of blood immediately welled up on his cheek. He didn't raise his hands to protect himself. He just stood there, completely paralyzed by the one thing he couldn't control. He could order the deaths of a dozen men, but he could not pull his mother out of her own mind. Rebecca didn't think. She moved. She stepped between Roman and Clara, putting her back to Roman. "Clara," Rebecca said. She didn't yell. She kept her voice sharp, flat, and demanding, the same tone she used to cut through the noise of a busy diner. "Clara, stop swinging the stick." Clara froze, her chest heaving. "They have Antonio." "Nobody has Antonio," Rebecca said firmly. She reached out and grabbed the center of the cane. Clara tried to yank it away, but Rebecca held tight. "Feel my hand. Feel it." She forced Clara's shaking, wrinkled hand to slide down the wood until it met Rebecca's warm skin. "It's Rebecca," she said, enforcing the reality. "You are in your bedroom. It is snowing outside. You broke an ugly lamp, and I am not cleaning it up." The bizarre, mundane statement acted like a bucket of cold water. Clara gasped, her rigid muscles suddenly collapsing. The cane slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. She slumped forward. Rebecca caught her, wrapping her arms around the frail woman, supporting her weight. Clara buried her face in Rebecca's shoulder, weeping silent, heavy tears of exhaustion and confusion. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, the lucidity painfully returning. "I'm sorry. The walls, they moved." "I know," Rebecca murmured, rubbing the old woman's back. "I've got you. They're ghosts, just ghosts." Rebecca helped Clara to the bed, pulling the thick duvet over her shaking form. She sat on the edge of the mattress, holding Clara's hand, until the erratic breathing slowed, and the medication finally pulled the old woman into a heavy, dreamless sleep. When Rebecca finally stood up, her joints ached. She turned around. Roman was still standing in the middle of the room. He hadn't moved. He was staring at her. The blood from the cut on his cheek had tracked down his jawline, staining the pristine white collar of his shirt. "Let's go," Rebecca whispered, gesturing to the door. She followed him out into the hallway, pulling the heavy door shut until it clicked. The silence of the corridor rushed back in. Roman leaned against the wall. The brutal mob boss looked entirely hollowed out. He raised a hand, pressing the heel of his palm against his eyes. It was a staggering display of vulnerability from a man who survived by never showing weakness. Rebecca walked over to a small side table in the hall, where a silver tray held a pitcher of water and a set of linen napkins. She poured a splash of water onto a napkin, walked back to Roman, and stopped in front of him. She didn't ask for permission. She reached up and gently dabbed the blood from his cheekbone. Roman flinched at the touch, but he didn't pull away. He lowered his hand and looked down at her. His eyes, usually an impenetrable black, were dark and stormy, filled with a crushing weight. "I can protect her from everything outside this house." Roman said, his voice a low, rough rumble. I can burn the city to the ground to keep her safe. But I can't stop this. No. Rebecca agreed quietly, wiping the blood from his jaw. You can't. You can't shoot dementia, Roman. I hate feeling useless. You aren't useless. You're just human. Roman looked at her. He looked at the purple shadows under her eyes, the simple cotton of her clothes, the stubborn set of her jaw. She didn't cower. She didn't look at him with the terrified reverence his men did. She saw the blood on his hands and the blood on his face, and she stood her ground. He reached up. His large, calloused hand covered hers where it rested against his cheek. He didn't push her away. He pressed her palm flat against his skin, closing his eyes for a brief, heavy second, drawing heat and grounding from her touch. "Why did you stay, Rebecca?" he asked softly. "You have your money now. You paid off Sullivan's debt. You could have walked out the front door a week ago." Rebecca looked at the sharp lines of his face. She thought about the cold, lonely apartment she had left behind. She thought about Clara, who needed her. And she thought about the terrifying, magnetic man standing in front of her, who had shattered a loan shark's face to protect her, and was now breaking apart over his mother's failing mind. "Because," Rebecca said, her voice barely a whisper, but steady as stone, "for the first time in my life, I'm not invisible." Roman's eyes opened. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by something fierce, hungry, and dangerously possessive. He moved his hand from hers, sliding it back to wrap around the nape of her neck. His thumb brushed against her jawline, his grip firm but reverent. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "You were never invisible to me," Roman murmured, his lips a breath away from hers. "Not from the second you stepped into that rain." He didn't kiss her. He didn't cross that final line. He simply held her gaze, a silent vow, passing between them in the dim hallway. He was giving her fair warning. If she didn't run now, she was his. Rebecca didn't step back. The illusion of safety shattered 3 days later. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron threatening another snowstorm. Rebecca was in the kitchen, brewing a pot of chamomile tea. Clara was resting in her room. The first sign that something was wrong was the sound. Or rather, the lack of it. The heavy rhythmic crunch of the perimeter guards walking the gravel paths outside suddenly ceased. Rebecca paused, the tea kettle hovering over the ceramic pot. She looked toward the small window above the sink. A shadow moved across the frosted glass. It was too fast, too fluid to be one of Roman's men. Then came the sound. It was a dull, heavy thwip, followed instantly by the shattering of the kitchen window. A suppressed bullet tore through the glass, embedding itself into the wooden cabinetry an inch from Rebecca's head with a violent crack. Wood splinters exploded outward, biting into her cheek. Rebecca dropped to the floor instantly. The kettle crashed to the tiles, sending boiling water cascading across her knees. She bit down on a scream, her survival instincts overriding the searing pain. Sullivan, she thought wildly, or whoever Sullivan worked for. The O'Keefe Syndicate. Roman had warned her that his world was mud, and now it was pouring through the windows. "Rebecca!" The roar came from the hallway. It was Roman. It wasn't the calm, commanding voice of the boss. It was the frantic shout of a man realizing his defenses had been breached. Another suppressed shot hit the refrigerator, tearing through the stainless steel. The hitman was outside, firing blind through the broken window, providing cover fire for a breach. Rebecca crawled across the wet floor, ignoring the burning in her legs, scrambling toward the doorway that led to the central hall. She reached the threshold, just as the kitchen's rear door was kicked off its hinges. A man stepped into the kitchen. He wore a ski mask and held a short, compact submachine gun. He saw Rebecca on the floor and raised the barrel. He never got to pull the trigger. Roman appeared in the hallway above Rebecca. He moved with a terrifying preternatural speed. He didn't hesitate. He didn't shout a warning. He raised a heavy pistol and fired twice. The concussive roar of the unsuppressed weapon in the confined hallway was deafening, a physical pressure that rattled Rebecca's teeth. Both rounds took the intruder perfectly in the chest. The man was thrown backward, collapsing in a heap of tangled limbs and blood on the kitchen tiles. Silence slammed back down over the house, ringing in Rebecca's ears. Roman stepped over Rebecca, his gun still raised, sweeping the kitchen. He kicked the dead man's weapon away, checked the shattered window, and then immediately dropped to one knee beside her. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands roughly grabbing her shoulders, his dark eyes scanning her frantically for blood. "Rebecca, look at me. Are you hit?" "No." She gasped, her ears ringing. The water the kettle. Roman looked at her soaked jeans. He let out a harsh, ragged breath, pulling her up against his chest. He held her so tightly she could feel the violent jackhammer pounding of his heart against her ribs. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, verifying she was alive. Footsteps thundered down the hall. Tommy skidded to a halt, an assault rifle gripped in his hands, his suit jacket abandoned. "Perimeter breach on the west wall, boss." Tommy barked, his eyes flickering briefly to the dead body in the kitchen. "O'Keefe's guys. They hit the front gate to draw us out, and sent 2 runners around the back. We neutralized the second one on the lawn. The estate is secure." "Lock it down," Roman growled, not letting go of Rebecca. "Nobody gets in or out. Put 10 men in the east wing. Now." "Yes, sir." Tommy vanished back down the hall. Roman finally pulled back. He looked at Rebecca. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold, stark reality of what had just happened. There was a dead body 3 feet away from them. Blood was pooling on the pristine white tiles. He expected her to scream. He expected her to demand to leave. This was the reality he had tried to shield her from, the poison of his life bleeding into hers. Roman stood up, pulling her up with him. His face hardened back into the ruthless mask of the syndicate boss. He took a step back, intentionally putting distance between them. "Tommy will pack your bags," Roman said. His voice was dead stripped of all emotion. It was a tactical retreat. "I will have a car take you to an airfield. I'll set up an account for you in whatever city you choose. You'll never have to work again." Rebecca leaned against the doorframe, her knees shaking, her cheek bleeding from the wood splinter. She looked at the dead man on the floor. She had lived her whole life terrified of the dark, terrified of men like Sullivan, terrified of the crushing weight of poverty. She looked up at Roman. He was offering her a way out. He was giving her a clean break, sacrificing the only light in his house because he thought the darkness would consume her. "No," Rebecca said. Roman's jaw tightened. "Rebecca, look at the floor. This isn't a game. They were testing the perimeter today. Next time they might bring a bomb. You are leaving. I am not running away." Rebecca pushed off the doorframe and walked toward him. She didn't look at the body again. She looked entirely at him. "You told me I was drowning in my old life. You were right. But I survived it. And I can survive this. You don't know what this is," Roman said, his voice dropping to a dangerous warning. "If you stay, you aren't just my mother's companion anymore. O'Keefe knows you're here now. If you stay, you are part of the family. You become a target. You belong to the mud." Rebecca reached out. She grabbed the lapels of his ruined shirt, pulling him down slightly so she could look directly into his eyes. She saw the violence there, the capacity for absolute cruelty. But she also saw the man who had stood paralyzed while his mother swung a cane at him. "I didn't run from you in the rain," Rebecca said, her voice fierce and unyielding. "I didn't run from Sullivan in the alley. I am not running now." Roman stared at her. The last remnants of his restraint snapped. He dropped his gun to the floor. His hands crashed down on her hips, hauling her flush against his body. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a bruising, desperate collision of teeth and heat born of adrenaline and the terrifying realization that he could have lost her. Rebecca kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his dark hair, anchoring herself to the storm. In the chaotic, blood-stained kitchen of a Mafia fortress, the waitress finally stopped running, choosing the warmth of the fire over the cold of the rain. When you have nothing left to lose, you don't run from the fire, you learn how to control it. Rebecca's choice changed the Costa family forever, proving that sometimes the strongest armor isn't made of steel, but of unyielding, grounded empathy. What did you think of Rebecca's ultimate decision to stay with Roman? Drop a like if this gritty romance kept you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on more intense, character-driven stories. Let me know in the comments, would you have taken the money and run?